There's a strong parallel between the practices of mindfulness and Ho'oponopono. Both of them offer a way for us to free ourselves from habitual reactions and perceptions that cause us emotional pain. The discipline of mindfulness is in constantly asking yourself what's really going on. It's about, first of all, noticing your feelings and your reactions, and then interrogating them. A mindfulness practice requires us to have the insight and the courage to acknowledge our feelings. We've all got blind spots, reactions that we don't like admitting because we're uncomfortable about what we think they say about us. What a mindfulness practice asks us to do is to notice those reactive emotions. When we're able to do that, when we gain some insight into the way we react to people and situations, it can take away their power to make us suffer. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. The difficult emotional responses that afflict us don't just go away because we want them to. And the more deep-seated and troubling they are, the more we want to disown them. And so, the less available they are to us to scrutinise. But to quote Carl Jung, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And once you call it fate, it means you've decided. There's nothing you can do about it. You're stuck with it. Mindfulness gives you a chance not to accept that fate. By developing the habit of consciously facing the things that distress us, we progressively gain greater insight into our emotional drivers. We start to understand not only how we react, but the underlying forces behind those reactions. Understanding those forces has the effect of undermining their power. Instead of experiencing them as something lurking in the shadows of our subconscious, something to be feared, they become familiar. And although they're still unwelcome, they can become, in a sense, a known quantity, something you've faced before and survived. Sometimes, when scrutinised closely, they can turn into nothing at all. Now, it's one thing to say that a mindfulness practice can have a transforming effect. It certainly can. But applying it to your life is not as simple as it sounds. It's easy enough to say to ourselves, okay, I'm going to pay attention to the way I react to things. The question is, how far are you prepared to go with it? How honest are you prepared to be with yourself? The limitation of a mindfulness practice is that, done in isolation, it's easy to delude ourselves that we're taking a good hard look at things when really we're still avoiding looking at the things that really trouble us. This is not because we're deficient, it's because we're human. Something that every psychotherapist knows is that people only make new realizations about themselves when they're ready to do so. It's the same with a self-directed mindfulness practice. Interrogating those emotional drivers and impulses and continuing to do so even as uncomfortable realizations arise takes courage and it takes time. In some ways, I see it as an act of surrender. By saying to myself, I am open to whatever realizations occur, I'm consciously relinquishing control of my own thoughts. Whereas my habit, consciously or otherwise, is to put limits on the things I'm prepared to look at and to investigate only those areas of my personality, my emotions and my desires that I'm relatively comfortable with. A genuine mindfulness practice requires me to wade into the dark waters that might contain the nasty beasties I've always avoided. There's a natural fear that I might come across things I'm ashamed of. Maybe I'll discover aspects of myself that I can't live with. It's quite common for people to fear that any process of emotional or psychological investigation, any sort of therapy, might lead to some sort of breakdown of normal functioning, as though one's psyche is a house of cards that might collapse if it's disturbed. So the reassurance that I would give is that our defences are there for a reason. The same survival instincts that stop us jumping off cliffs operate in our psyche as well. Any practice of psychological exploration, including a self-directed mindfulness practice, can only progress at a rate that we can deal with. Yes, it takes courage to surrender that control and to allow the awareness of some uncomfortable aspects of our personality to arise. But developing the habit of examining our emotional reactions as they occur has its own rewards. As we gradually learn to recognize our own patterns, we gain more agency in handling them. Instead of being floored by them every time they occur, we learn instead to anticipate them. And once we get to the point of saying, there it is again, that same old fear, anger, resentment, shame, whatever, that kicks in every time, then we start to get some perspective on it. And then maybe we start to see some options. We start to find new and more useful ways of responding to it. And this is where I think the parallel with Ho'oponopono comes in. In using the practice of saying, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you, when we find ourselves in distress, it can have the same effect as a mindfulness process. It can undermine that reflex response of rage or fear or shame or whatever it is. It can create the space for us to stop, take a breath, and consider what's really going on. The purpose of this channel is to look at strategies for well-being, life hacks that can bring us greater degrees of satisfaction, peace, and happiness. If that's something that you think could be useful for you, please subscribe, and I'll talk to you again soon. The practices discussed in this video are intended as general advice for those interested in pursuing a mindfulness practice with the aim of achieving a higher degree of personal fulfillment and self-awareness. They are not intended as advice for the remediation of serious psychological dysfunction or mental illness.